And as always, a very warm welcome to this week's Life Issues. 30 years ago, it was decided it was time to quantify what it means to provide a level playing field for people living with the constrictions of disability in the UK. And so, the Disability Discrimination Act was born. Its goal was to end discrimination, to ensure fair treatment in areas such as employment, access to goods and services, and public life, and require reasonable adjustment and improved accessibility. Whether it succeeded or not depends on who you speak to, and certainly from its very early days, many people seemed more interested in looking for loopholes to avoid the requirements rather than to embrace the spirit of what the Act was about. For example, the infamous 2 ticks system for employment that set out clear commitments for employers to follow in recruiting people with disability and avoiding prejudice and discrimination. But so often, disabled applicants found it to be a tick box exercise rather than a real or meaningful change in attitude and opportunity. In 2010, the Disability Discrimination Act was amalgamated into the Equalities Act, and it sought to build on what had already been done to expand recognition of where discrimination could be found, and to claim very clearly that because discrimination in any form was unacceptable in a modern society, we needed to legislate. No bad thing, we might say. But where do 30 years of legislation leave the lot of disabled people? Especially when government policy seems to drive down levels of support, and when the media uses scrounger-type language around benefits, and where transport systems leave even a former Olympian and member of the House of Lords dragging herself across the floor of a train because there is no assistance for her at her destination. And of course, the same media that stirred up antipathy towards disability was appalled that a national treasure should be treated in this way. We seem confused about our attitudes, don't we? But it's guesstimated that around 16 million people in the UK are classified as disabled. In working age people, that works out at nearly 1 in 4 people. And of course, the range and restriction of disability is varied, but the DDA, Disability Discrimination Act, didn't aim to give special treatment, but it did aim to give equal opportunity. So has it? Today I am joined by 2 old friends of UCB. They both live with the realities of disability, and they are both outspoken campaigners on disability rights and attitudes around disability, both inside and outside the church. Katie Tupling is an author and speaker and disability advisor for the Oxford Diocese. For many years, she was a parish priest and is the co-founder of Disability and Jesus, a user-led task group that wrestles not just with attitudes towards disability, but also theology, discipleship, and church practice in the light of the experience of disability. If you want to find out more about that group, then the book that she co-authored, Pilgrims in the Dark, will tell you. Stef Benstead has worked for a number of think tanks and organisations over the years to highlight the reality for people who are disabled in the UK. Her passion in this, well, I think can be seen in the titles of her books. Second Class Citizens, which looks at the history of how we treat disabled people in this country, and also the way in which the welfare state is being impacted by contemporary and modern policy from government, and also Just Worship, a call for Christians to work for socio-economic justice as part of their worship of God. Guys, welcome to Life Issues. It's good to have you here. My first question has to be, what's it like to live with disability in the UK today? Katie, why don't you start for us?
Thank you. I occupy a really odd space. So I am what you might call a non-disabled disabled person. Let's go with that. So I, to all intents and purposes, live and occupy a space that most non-disabled people would recognise. I live in a normal, unadapted house. Use the word normal very carefully there, but you know what I mean. I drive an unadapted car, apart from having a blue badge, so I am entitled to. I'm not scrounging it. I hold down what you might call a semi-normal job. So I work for the Church of England, which isn't necessarily normal, but it is a paid salaried job. And I am married to an unadapted husband and have a son who is also unadapted. So to all intents and purposes, I come across as able-bodied, non-disabled. I use crutches to walk with, and I personalised those some years ago. It's expensive, but nicer than NHS crutches. And I've now got a wheelchair because I'm an ambulant wheelchair user. So for distances, I use a wheelchair. And for terrain, I use a mobility scooter. They were decisions carefully made because I had issues around stigma, perception, and all that kind of thing. So I kind of occupy this weird world of coming across as non-disabled, but actually I have cerebral palsy, so I'm completely disabled by that and by attitudes and society. So it's kind of weird that in that I can blend in if I want to and need to, but I have to sometimes choose not to, enable to remind people in the room that disabled people are actually in the room with them, not just a thing being talked about. So I can hide and I can be a bit of a ninja, which is a self-protection thing, because when you come out, therefore, as disabled, as the person in the room that you're all talking about as a theory out there, the mixture of responses in the room is really fascinating. Some people get that sort of pitying head tilt of compassion where they go, "Oh, I'm so sorry." You want to go, "Why?" Do unpack that for a moment. Some people look a bit taken aback that you've somehow covered up the secrets that they didn't want to talk about, and how dare you be here and not tell us. And other people are fascinated and ask some of the weirdest questions that you've heard in your life, not for broadcast, obviously. So it's tricky because you've got all of these different emotions and responses coming at you that you're then having to deal with, as well as some of the more, what you might call the more tabloid headline responses around mistrust, around presuming that you're scrounging or that you're wanting things that are unfair, as well as just trying to access goods and services that are not accessible yet. So attitudes and culture, I think, are the biggest things that are out there that still tell a story of to be disabled is quite pitiable, and we're trying to all avoid that. What I call the oil of Olay syndrome. We must strive to be perfect and beautiful. You can be both of those and still have disabled people around. And the fear that disability is somehow going to be pervasive and catching and make you as a human being somehow less.
And it is, Steph, that strange mix, isn't it, of that disability is something to be, in inverted commas, and I am choosing my words very carefully, but no doubt at some point we'll say something that actually shows I don't really understand the reality of what it's like to live with disability. But it is that mix of disability being seen as something to be pitied, in inverted commas, and yet also something to be treated with suspicion. I mean, the old title for somebody with disability was somebody who was handicapped, that they were coming cap in hand asking for help. That sort of mentality still seems, despite the legislation, to pervade attitudes, Steph, or am I wrong with that?
I think that is very much what it feels like. Although I think there's also a third category, which is the Paralympian hero category, that disabled people are some sort of superstar, heroic, amazing proof that you can do whatever you put your mind to. But I think for most people, it's going to be that combination of pity and mistrust. And I think it's often the mistrust that comes across most strongly in my experience, because the pity is sort of conditional on you first proving that you don't need to be mistrusted. But the mistrust, it's very pervasive, because it's not just, oh, I see it on Twitter, oh, I see it in the media, but it's also, I can be having a conversation with a family member or someone I know at church, and they will, or a neighbour, and they will just casually drop in. So I know this lady who said she's disabled because of back pain, but I saw her dancing in her garden the other week. And I very rarely actually challenge that, because partly because I just can't always process fast enough. I sort of hope that I will get better at challenging it. But often, sort of when I go home and I'm thinking what I should have said, I'm thinking, okay, so this person has back pain, so they're going to have difficulty moving, and depending on the issue, the pain might occur in the moment, or for someone like me where I've got neuropathic pain, it's actually normally the next day if I do too much, because it sort of makes my whole body inflamed and that increases the pain. But maybe she'd also had some extra painkillers that morning, and maybe she can't take those painkillers all the time because they're an opioid painkiller that's addictive, so she only take them occasionally. And maybe her mental health was really struggling, and she just needed to have a moment where she had less pain and she could do the dancing that she loved, and she could be outside as she loved, and she could boost her mental health even if it was going to cause her more pain the next day.
Yes.
The person walking down the street doesn't see any of that, but now they're mistrusting this lady and who knows however many other disabled people, because they've assumed that if you have back pain, it's going to be something that is very like black and white. It always stops you from doing X group of activities. It never stops you from doing Y, rather than going, well, if I take painkillers, if I don't do Z, then I can do X, but I won't be able to do Y tomorrow. So there's just that constant trust.
Yeah, and is it that... Well, othering is always a thing when it comes to discrimination and prejudice. And I wonder if that's part of it. And obviously there are occasionally reports, and we see reports, and maybe the way in which they are trumpeted is part of the problem. Well, we see reports of people who have been in receipt of benefits, and then it's been showed that they, had their situation had vastly improved. They maybe didn't need that benefit to the same degree, and so on. They tend to make big headlines, those stories. But is it more fundamentally that we look at people with disability as a separate group, and the suspicion of the other is very easy to embrace because we have ignorance of that person's situation or their reality? Katie?
I was driving up and down the M1 yesterday because that's my life. And two BMW drivers shot past me at more than the speed limit. So I am absolutely clear that all BMW drivers speed. All BMW drivers are utterly appalling on the motorways, and they all weave. Audi drivers, I saw one of those yesterday on the M1, weaving in and out of the lanes, undertaking, overtaking, wobbling free, whatever. And they were also over the speed limit because I was doing a very steady 69 because I'm a very responsible driver at all times, and therefore my baseline can be trusted. So on that basis, all BMW drivers speed and all Audi drivers undertake and overtake and drive appallingly across the lanes. Now, you see, all the Audi drivers and BMW drivers now listening are saying, that's a bit unfair. You can't, just one person in how many million drivers? Exactly that. So we've seen a couple of examples where people have been pushing those boundaries around welfare and capability, but they do not set a precedent for everybody else.
And the thing about the athletes, the Paralympians, especially, Stef, it is that sort of attitude that looks at a Paralympian, looks at a disabled athlete and goes, oh, aren't they doing well? Considering. It's that sort of, again, distancing of people that is, to me, seems to be part of the problem. If we draw people close rather than push them away so that they're a group over there down a sideline somewhere, we're far more likely to understand the reality of their life than judge our perception of their life.
Yeah, and I think that's particularly important for Christians because actually that's what Jesus modeled for us. Like, God came to live as a human on earth, and he spent 30 years doing that before he started his ministry because he knew that he needed to experience what humanity is like in order to be our saviour. And Christians therefore should understand this idea that actually when we don't understand someone else's experience, we should be finding ways to go and live alongside them and listen to them and learn from them and find a way, as far as that's possible, to share in that experience so that we can have an understanding, rather than just judging and going, I think this is what is happening, but actually I've never really listened or walked with these people or understood what is going on.
So if that's the model that Jesus set, what's it like to be disabled in terms of the church? Surely then we are listening, we are understanding, we are getting it right, aren't we, Stef?
Oh, probably Katie's better to respond. I guess it's going to depend on the church and to what extent they know that they've got disabled people and what those people's needs are. Like in my church, actually, they were really good a number of years ago. They let me bring my own chair. I've got one of those like IKEA lightweight chairs that they let me keep at church that I can sit in. And that's been a real blessing to have like a proper comfortable chair. Because, you know, like churches just don't do comfortable chairs. They don't seem to be able to manage. So that's been a really good thing. On the other hand, when they had a refurbishment project some years ago, it didn't seem to occur to anyone that maybe they needed some powered doors so that you could, like a wheelchair user could press a button and open the door. So there are some doors that like, I actually use a mobility scooter, so it's got, you know, like almost like a bumper at the front, so I can and do just drive into doors. It's a push door, but I can't really open them towards me. And if I were to switch to a power chair, I'd struggle. Like that didn't seem to occur to them. And like the disabled toilet, like everything's very white, so they had to go back later and put in like a contrasting toilet seat because we were like, look, someone with visual impairment or dementia can't actually see where the toilet is because it's white on white.
Yes.
So sometimes people just don't think. But
and the
sometimes when they do think they will help, it's just, but then sometimes they'll be like, oh no, there's this other issue that we have to think about. But yeah, it can be mixed.
And the reason I came to you first on that, Stef, is because I know from previous experience of Katie that this is something that she builds up a head of steam about quite quickly. Because, I mean, you were, and I suppose technically still are, you know, member of the clergy, church leader, but you were a local church vicar for many, many years as a person living with disability. I mean, is it just about lack of thought and practical issues, or is there something more fundamental in our theology that we need to take on board, Katie?
I'm going to give you a typical Anglican answer, which is yes, both, and no, both. Anglican fudge, we should box it and sell it. So there is something about, as Stef said, sometimes people just don't know what they don't know. So you get a disabled person who comes along and asks questions if they have the energy to do that and the agency and know that they're okay to ask questions. There's a lot of internalized ableism in our own heads to go, just simmer down, blend in, don't make a fuss, blah, blah, blah. But assuming there's someone like me who rocks up and says, actually, can I ask some questions about accessibility, about what's missing, what's there, and sometimes people look and go, do you know, I didn't know. That's really great to know that. And what can we do about it? Which is why disability advisors across the Church of England in different dioceses and other denominations too are a really helpful thing, because they're the ones who know what's missing and can come along and say, right, can I help you with this? Can I help you with that? So sometimes it is as simple as people just don't know what they don't know. And when they do know, if they've got the good grace to say, I didn't realise, what can we do to change that? Fantastic, we can work with that. Sometimes people do know, and for whatever reasons, which is usually cultural and historical and habitual, there's a pushback against, well, I'm sorry that there isn't a toilet in the church for you, but it's a Saxon building and we can't possibly make changes. Well, you can, I've seen it done. But Betty down the road doesn't mind everyone using her outside toilet. Oh, great. That's better than a bucket behind the hedge. So sometimes there's a real kind of cultural, historical, we've always managed kind of narrative that goes with that. That's much harder to engage with. And sometimes it is very practical, which is a church really wants their building to match their theology of inclusion and welcome and belonging. But they are literally, you've got to get through the farmer's field to get to the Saxon building in the middle of nowhere. And they look at it and go, there's only 4 of us keeping this place going. We don't have the money. What can we do? Because we desperately have the vision, but we don't have the resources. And that's hard to work with in terms of systems, but at least they've got vision, which is much harder to get into people's heads. So sometimes it is just habit, circumstances, resources, a lack of knowledge. Sometimes it is poor theology, a theology hangover that still treats disabled people with a charity model of, oh, poor you, but, God loves a trier. Or the individual model of, well, I'm glad I'm not you. What did you do in a past life that maybe there's sin hanging around in your body? That's a really poor theological standpoint to take. It could be the eugenics model, which is, well, actually, we're all meant to be made in God's image, and that's clearly not God's image. So maybe you could either cure that or disappear. And the made in God's image one is a model that everyone spouts and goes, oh, we're all made in God's image, fearfully and wonderfully made. But not being perfect is the human condition.
Yes.
Whatever sliding scale that looks like. So something of not being perfect is within the image of God, which means that God is limited too in some ways. That's a challenging one for this podcast, so that's fair enough. So sometimes the church experience mirrors the societal experience because it's full of human beings, which we share. And sometimes it is history, it is tradition, it is habit, it is the narratives that you've grown up with. And sometimes it is very poor theology that's never been challenged.
And yet the Bible does give us a basis, Steph, on which we can build a form of worship, a form of life of worship that actually models something very different to society if we are willing to see it and willing to pick it up.
Yeah, we can see in the Bible and from Jesus' approach to people, his welcome and his love and the overall desire for good relationship, for good unity, for welcoming all who want to come. And the church should be able to do that. It should be able to say that everyone who wants to come should be able to come, and it should be thinking about how do you make it so that people feel welcome and so that practically it's possible for people to come. And I know, as Katie said, there are definitely churches where the age of the building and the size of the congregation just mean it's probably not going to be possible anytime soon to make it completely accessible. But that willingness makes a big difference. I certainly found when I'm talking with my church about what are the sort of the limitations in the building, if we can have a conversation where there's a clear willingness to make it accessible, but maybe there's another issue that needs to be considered. So one that we talked about recently was the question of security, and there are different access points to the church building, but there's also a risk, sort of increasing risk in society of people coming in who would perhaps pose, might be sort of more violent or aggressive person who might pose a risk to the people in the building, and therefore sort of security risks around where can you have a door that you just press a button and it opens, but now absolutely anyone can access the building, and is that actually safe? It's as long as we have that conversation and the church is willing to say, I do actually want this to be an accessible building, but sometimes that's not the only consideration. That willingness to have the conversation makes a big difference, and that really helps to know that there is that desire that the place is accessible, even if it's not possible in every situation.
So 30 years on, we had Disability Discrimination Act, and we also had the Equalities Act, endeavouring to change attitudes and create that level playing field that was much vaunted and often talked about. Have attitudes improved substantively since the bad old days of the 70s, the 80s, and the early 90s, Katie?
I knew you'd come to me first. I was pulling some faces. Dear listeners, I have a very interesting face at the moment as I try to articulate what I feel about attitudes and culture within society. Do you know what's fascinating? I'm going to take you to the medieval times now. So come with me through time and space to the medieval times. If I were to land myself there in a TARDIS and say hello to all the villagers, they would say, "Oh, we like these things propping you up. The farm boy just uses broom handles because his leg doesn't work." And we'd have a great conversation where we would share stories about legs that don't work or limbs that don't work, because the high levels of comparative poverty to now were huge. If you lived to 35, you were considered to be old. People were dying of smallpox and all sorts of things everywhere. So everybody had some kind of illness or situation where their bodies did not work, but it was normal. There was no othering. If you were healthy, you were unusual. And so they wouldn't have a concept of disability because everybody was in the same boat. Everyone lived with a human body that didn't work. And then somehow through kind of Reformation times and Industrial Revolution times and into now, we've sort of sanitized what the human body should look like. So we now find ourselves living in a period of time in history where we are desperate to be perfect. And that is the ultimate goal, which means that anyone who doesn't fit that idea of perfection is somehow letting the side down for humanity. And a lot of companies will benefit from this financially from you buying their products to try and reach that perfect goal. So this kind of 30-year comparison is almost too short a time frame to say have things shifted and moved, because it takes a long time for a societal narrative to go through any kind of significant shift. But within this
some
context,
things have improved, haven't they? I mean, the truth is, before DDA, you could, if you were in a wheelchair, you could be denied entry to restaurants and cinemas and so on. I mean, there are now legal requirements. You could be sacked if you revealed that you've got a disability. Employers can't do that anymore. So some things have improved, Katie.
So systems have had improvements made to them. Enforcement is really hard. It's all civic law. So the Employment Act is hard to enforce if you're on the wrong end of it. Trying to prove that it was the basis for disability that you were let go or didn't get through your probation is the burden of proof is on the disabled person to prove that they have been let down by the employer. That's a really high thing. And who can afford to take your employer to civic court where you've got to pay all your own court costs up front unless you happen to win, and then the judge might say you get some of those back. Most disabled people are living under the poverty line, so none of us can really afford to take anyone to court. So some things have been improved in the law to say you should really try doing this and make sure these things are in place. But the enforcement of that and the pushback and taking people to court when they're in breach of that is really hard to prove. But you also asked about attitudes. Have the attitudes changed toward disabled people? And I think they just got polite. I think society got polite for fear of being in breach of the law and the Equalities Act. I think attitudes just went under the surface. And I think when we went through things like Brexit, which was a major upheaval for the country, and a lot of finger pointing about who's in, who's out, who belongs here and who doesn't. And then again through the pandemic, which was then, well, whose fault is this and who's going to try and kill us off? And who are we being restricted to save other people for that don't deserve it? All those attitudes that had gone quiet came bubbling back to the surface. So I don't think the attitudes have changed, even if the law is doing its best to try and make things more accountable.
What do you think, Stef? I mean, there are some changes been positive then, but still an awful lot of negativity. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, there's a lot of negativity. So there are positive changes. There are more places that just have built-in ramps. There are more places that have powered doors so you can press a button and they open. But there are still lots of problems. Just like getting around my local streets on my mobility scooter, there are a lot of places where the curbs have not been dropped. And I might come off the pavement at one point and I can't get back on for like 100 meters. And I'm just driving down the road on my little scooter because I can't get back on the pavement. Or the pavements are really uneven. They have some tree roots in the way, street furniture, a lot of just general inaccessibility that makes it really fatiguing and painful to get around the public environment. And then like all the little shops that actually just don't have space to be accessible for a wheelchair to get in, or can't afford to have a ramp because the ramp would just stick out into the pavement and that's now obstructing the pavement. But just the general attitudes. There's a strong narrative in the UK that as a country we're quite work shy and malingering. That's been around for several decades, probably picking up particularly strongly in the 1980s when Thatcher caused some economic problems that resulted in 3 million people being unemployed. But obviously you don't want to say that that might actually be a government-caused problem. It's much easier to just turn around and go, wow, the culture shifted overnight and 2 million people decided they couldn't be bothered to work. And that sort of narrative has just kept going. And it's really politically appealing because it's really nice if I can say, I don't have to put myself out to care for you because your poverty and your illness is your fault. And in fact, the best way I can care for you is to abandon you because you need to learn and you need to grow up and become a mature, healthy, well-rounded person. And that's really nice to hold. I mean, it's not nice. I mean, for the person who holds that view, that's very comfortable. But to turn around to people and say, actually, God says you have a responsibility to people in poverty. You have a responsibility to those who are sick and who are needy. You have a responsibility to the stranger, to the homeless, to the person who's unprotected. And you need to go and find out what is going on with those people and why they are facing the difficulties they face. And what are you going to do about it as an individual? Because the resources that I have given you as God are not just for you, they're for those people.
Yeah.
And I've given them to you so that you can steward them and make sure that the people who are in need get what they need, because actually it really belongs to them. That's a much more challenging position. It takes a lot more effort. And to then also have to sort of take that position in a society that wants to say, no, it's just poor people's fault. And to sort of stand up to people who are saying, no, we should be collecting less tax to fund government services and we should be paying less in benefits. That's can be hard. It gets quite tiring, but that is how we should be. And instead, we've just got governments who are constantly going, there are too many people on sickness and disability benefits and more of them can work, even though we've been saying this for decades and not actually managing to get any of them into work because I don't know, they might actually be too sick to work. It's just hard having this sort of relentless political and media narrative that if only someone would tell us we could work, we'd go out and get a job and be cured, and to have public believing that. And it comes back to that mistrust again, that we're not trusted to be reliable narrators of our own lives.
It is almost KTA stepping back, or it feels that certainly from both of your perspectives, society is stepping back to those sort of Victoriana attitudes of the feckless poor and the undeserving poor and the judgmental attitude. But at the same time, I mean, Disability Discrimination Act, the Equality Act, it did bring in things like, like benefits to support people and to try and create this equal playing field, level playing field that they talk about, Katie. So, I mean, again, I put it to you, surely some things are better than the bad old days.
Some things are, and it's interesting. I'm going to give the government the benefit of the doubt just for a brief second. But don't worry, I'm not going to last too long. Archbishop Desmond Tutu once said, it's all very well fishing people out of the river because they're drowning, but you also have to go upstream and figure out why they're in the river in the first place. So I would love it if government rhetoric could be not about saying you shouldn't be in the river drowning. What are you playing at? Just learn to swim. But actually going upstream and saying, why are these people who clearly can't swim in the river in the first place? Who's pushing them in? And if it happens to be government policy pushing them in, then to hold their hands up and to say, that's down to us. We need to sort this out. Like Stef said, it's not good enough just to say to disabled people, if you just try harder, you can get there. That's not how it works. So the DDA, the Equalities Act, they did put something of an onus on society, on employers, on systems, on public services to say you need to do your bit to make sure that these folks can access what it is you're offering. Now, the Purple Pound, which is disabled people's pocket money and salaries and taxes and everything and national insurance contributions, is a huge part of the economy. We put a lot of money into the economy as well as apparently draining it through welfare. not true in the government's own figures. So the Equality Act did say to everybody, you have a burden of proof to make sure that what you do can be accessed by everybody, not just the fit and the healthy. But like I say, it's really hard because it's under civic law to push back against any of that. Yeah. So when you are a guide dog user and you've hailed a taxi on an app that's inaccessible because your screen reader doesn't access it at all, but you've managed to do it and you've declared in your booking, I am a blind user and I have a guide dog, and the taxi driver pulls up, looks at the dog and drives away, that's really hard to then go to a judge and go, yeah, this keeps happening a lot. Well, how can you burden of proof? Or maybe they just got the wrong thing. Maybe there was a mistake in the booking. Maybe this happens all the time. When the bus drivers pull up, they refuse to put the ramp out and they say, oh no, it's the wrong kind of pavement. Wrong kind of pavement? What are you talking about? Or there's already a pushchair in the wheelchair space and they won't tell the parent, you need to move that to one side, we'll get you both in that space. They refuse to do that. That's really hard to push back because the evidence and the burden is on the individual, not on the bus driver to say, you have to do this. They can give any narrative as to why it's impossible at the time. To a cafe owner who could move the furniture outside in a way that you could still get through in a wheelchair, but they look at their street furniture and go, yeah, but I like it like this and it works for most of my customers and I don't have to make it work for you because there are other ways of going to different cafes. So it's all of those things that the Equalities Act says you should be doing these things, but there's not the teeth for the individual who faces this constant rebuttal and obstacles to say, but why are you not doing it?
And do you think, Stef, that, I mean, the title of one of your books is Just Worship. And as I mentioned earlier on, the idea of the book is for Christians to recognize that true worship is actually to speak up for those who are being treated unjustly within society. That's the fundamental concept of it. Should the church be taking more of a clear voice on issues of benefit cuts and changes to the way benefit is delivered and attitudes towards moving street furniture or anything? Should the church actually be leading the way in this argument rather than, as it often is, colluding with the rhetoric?
Yes, it should. I can understand that the church may not want to get into specific policy arguments about how exactly do we address, like what's the exact policy we put in place for this or that particular issue, because that would stem into things that aren't part of the church's expertise around questions of how exactly do economies work and what are the other political considerations. But the church should be able to stand up and say that the country as a whole should make sure there are enough jobs for everyone. And that if there aren't enough jobs, the government makes sure that there is an alternative income, because society has failed a person if there isn't a job for that person to go to when they can work. They should be able to stand up and say that those who can't work should be supported, not just to stay alive, but actually participate fully in society.
Yeah.
They should be able to stand up and say that we should, as a society, look to see how do we make sure that people can access healthcare and social care and the education that enables them to then participate in society as an adult in terms of things around work and culture and having sort of relationship and community life. We should be able to say that there are some really basic principles about what humanity is, that we are not here simply to work, to produce money for the economy as a whole, that our worth is not measured by how many things we make each day or how much money we earn, that we are allowed to just stop and say, I've earned enough money now, I can live, I can now have a social life. That we allow people who can't work to also engage in that social life, community, religion. And we should be able also as a church to be thinking about, are there practical ways that that we can explore these issues. Like as a church, how do we listen to members of our community to understand what the community's needs are and work with the community to meet those needs? And then from there, can we then go to our local councillors or to our MPs and say, these are the issues we're seeing locally, and these are the needs, and this is where legislation is causing a problem, and can you take that to government? And then as a national church, we could say, this is what we're hearing from all our local churches about some of the bigger issues that, things that we see repeatedly across the country, and issues where policy is repeatedly being the problem, and therefore government might want to change policy. There's a lot that churches could do, even without going to a specific, I am of this particular political party, or I espouse this particular policy. But churches can and should be standing up and saying, these are the principles of what a good society looks like based on what we know. And these are what we are hearing from our communities about what are the problems in this country and how to address them.
And Katie, there's the Bible's very clear about us giving a voice to the voiceless, and the idea of the followers of Jesus are people who speak up on behalf of those who are sidelined, those who are pushed away and estranged from society. But there's also a mission element to this as well, isn't there? In that we're not just there to represent the opinions of those who are disabled or othered in any sort of way. We're also there to bring a message of there is a safe space, a safe harbour, there is a home you can come to, that's the good news that we have.
Yeah, when I do a lot of teaching around the country, because different dioceses don't have a disability advisor themselves. So 36 out of our 42 do, but some don't. And then most of them are volunteers as well across the Church of England. So there's a growing number of people who are wanting to advocate and to bring across this exact message. And I hold them together as a network. And a lot of my own teaching that I do across various aspects of church life, this is what I'm trying to advocate. We can talk about having a welcome sign outside, but are people genuinely welcome when they come? We talk about accessibility. If they're welcome, can they get in? And what can we do to change that? Once they're in, are they included in the life of the church, or tolerated, or put on a rota and, that'll do, pat them on the head. If they're welcome, they can get in and they're included. Do they actually belong? Do people miss them when they're not there? And in all of that, heading towards a safe space where you can therefore talk about vocation. What does God have in mind for me? Who am I in the image of God? What place do I have as a human being? Where is the good news for me as a human being? Well, who's Jesus? All those basic things that churches are, the environment you create where these things can be talked about and discussed and understood and learned. But if you are disabled or neurodivergent, just trying to feel like you're welcome, you can even get in, you're included, and can you belong, are all the barriers to remove so you can get to that place of conversation about being loved by God, the mercy, the grace, the forgiveness, salvation, all that stuff, and who Jesus is. And I think the C of E as an institution is getting better at identifying and recognizing that journey, identifying those barriers, and wanting the system to play its part in removing as many of those barriers as possible. Like I said, 36 out of 42 dioceses in the Church of England have a disability advisor. Most are volunteers in their spare time with minimal amount of centralised resources. But we work together as a really good team across the network to share resource with each other and to do training together so we can better help our churches. So churches are better resourced because of these folk. Because we've got an enabling leaders programme that takes 12 people per cohort per year who are disabled, neurodivergent, clergy and senior leaders, and to try and give them peer support and training and encouragement to envision what could be for them as disabled and neurodivergent clergy and church leaders. It's small numbers because we don't have a lot of money to invest to do that, and we keep asking for a bit more, and each year we try and get a new cohort together. There are great things happening in small spaces. We've got working parties looking across the Church of England at different aspects of children and young people and mental health and neurodivergence and comms, how we do our communications. There's a huge amount going on, but very quietly behind the scenes, quite invisibly, ironically. It's really hard to change an institution and a system as vast and as diverse and as polarised and as individual as the C of E. But I have hope that it's getting towards where it needs to be. It just takes a long time to turn around a tanker at sea.
And we're running out of time, as is often the case when we have these sorts of conversations. Time gets away from us. But we've recently seen a change of government. I think many people hoped that a Labour government would bring attitudes that were perhaps more understanding, more empathetic, more willing to engage with the spirit of the idea of support for people with disability. As things are looking, much of the rhetoric seems to be, well, if not the same, it may be even worse from a disability point of view under the new government as it was under the old government. What are in just a couple of sentences, what are your thoughts, hopes, fears for the future in this, Stef?
I'm not sure I can do that in a couple of sentences. I did think when you said we've just had a change of government, I wanted to be like, have we? Because it might be a different set of MPs, but it doesn't feel like the government as such has changed. I think what is particularly frightening is that when the Tories were in power, we had an opposition party that said, these cuts are going too far. You need to support sick and disabled people. With Labour in power, with them proposing cuts that go further than anything the Tories had suggested when the Tories were in power, the Tories as an opposition party are going, oh, your cuts aren't going far enough, you need to go even further. So I think that is what is so frightening, is there's no opposition party to hold the government in check. There's no opposition party where we can go, well, at least when they get in power, they'll reverse some of the bad decisions. We've just got two parties working really hard to be worse than the other one. And I don't know, I guess it just doesn't feel like there's a lot of hope for seeing any change in that anytime soon. And I would really like to see, particularly the Church of England, because they have a particular relationship in this country as a denomination, because they have bishops in the House of Lords, they ought to be making statements on these kind of things about what does a Christian approach look like. And it is disappointing when that's not happening.
Katie?
I agree with my learned friend Stef. Absolutely. We shifted a colour from blue to red. We shifted a PM. Well, there's several shifts in PM over the last couple of years. I've lost count of how many we've had now. Some more recent than others. I can't tell the difference as to, if you just landed me now and said, which colour is in charge of our country, I'd be like, I don't know. Listening to the rhetoric is about disabled people are basically not trying hard enough. If they just tried a bit harder, they'd be fine. They're not economically viable. They're draining all the welfare we have. Some of them are fraudsters, and we can't afford as a country to have that level of fraud in our budget. Look at the numbers. That's not the biggest issue you have with the national budget and debt anyway. So the language is just getting worse. There's more blame. There's more fear. There's more finger pointing at the same group of people, which is anyone who is disabled or neurodivergent and asks for reasonable adjustments. Who decides what's reasonable? Anyone who pops their head up and says, this is what I need, and the Equalities Act says I can ask for this, immediately the rhetoric is, oh, well, that's going to be problematic. That's going to be difficult to manage. That's going to be, are you sure you need that? Are you just not trying hard enough? And those attitudes can be voiced by employers because we're hearing it in Parliament from both sides of the chamber.
Yeah. And in the light of that, surely we should have, as followers of Jesus and followers of his example, something to say. You see, the much vaunted goal of the DDA, Disability Discrimination Act, was to create a level playing field that would address the injustice, would address practical and support issues faced by people living with the impact of disability, would call on society to recognize the value of all people and to take a stand against discrimination and prejudice. they were laudable goals. And if it did nothing else, at least it flagged that up as a valuable aspiration for a modern society. But it has to be said, and you've heard it clearly today, that if you are a person living in the UK in 2025, dealing with the reality of some form of disability, well, you could be forgiven for thinking that in the light of media attitudes and government cuts and healthcare inadequacies, the scales have been tipped once more against you. And that level playing field is more like a hill you have to climb. Those initial changes that brought the Disability Discrimination Act and brought that aspiration came about because public and pressure group opinion forced political will through the end of the 80s and into the early 90s. Christian Principle was behind much of it, and Christian voices were very active in calling for rights, not charity. And as the DDA became the Equalities Act, that idea of rights, not charity, was extended to other groups as well. So have their level playing fields become a hill? That's maybe another life issues to explore that. But if we don't follow through on the commitment of previous generations and lift our voice in a form of worship that is the pursuit of justice for any and all who are oppressed, neglected, or sidelined, where does that leave our society? And what does that say about our message as a church to that society? This has been UCB Life Issues. I'm Paul Hammond. Big thank you to Stef and Katie for joining us. And thank you as well to Rebecca, my producer this week. If you have an opinion on this, why not email me, paul@ucb.co.uk, and join us next week for another Life Issues. Ta-da.